Wonder if that's any better. How quickly can you react to me saying hello?
Hello.
Ah, that's much better then. Okay.
Yeah, you're not glitching at all now. Now it looks
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
that's good.
smooth. Yeah.
All right. So, should we? Is everybody ready? Should we dive in? We usually sort
Yeah,
of just.
I think I've got our track, and just so that I'm on the same page as I am the DJ today, we are doing Kerosene, right?
That's right.
Kerosene, nice. I got it
I am
queued up. and
here
I've
to
got-
bring down the average IQ of your listener.
Oh, not at all. We've had a very broad range of genres and types of music to talk about, which was kind of the point of all this. So I'm glad that it's going to be something kind of different today. So yeah,
Yeah,
Excellent.
I'm,
I think that's
I'm
what.
glad it's something I'd never really heard of.
Yeah, same.
as well.
Oh,
I was
excellent.
not
And
familiar.
I've been doing a lot of kind of refamiliarizing myself with the track, with the album, with the state of the band at the time, and so I've got a lot of context not only around why I chose it and how it influenced me, but a lot of context to share around that insane guitar tone you hear at the beginning, which is legendary, and who was involved and all that other stuff. So we can go as deep or stay high level as you guys want. I'll let you guide where you want the conversation to go.
Oh,
That sounds
fantastic!
great.
Yeah, nice one, man. Okay, so we're finally at episode number 6 after a couple of false starts, and we're joined today by the prolific, and I've had to write this down because there are so many things that you do, but
You need a bigger
prolific
post-it.
Nathan, yeah, prolific Nathan Moody, who is a mastering engineer. He's an artist, creative director, sound designer, and all coming from the label Obsidian Sound. Welcome, Nathan. Thanks so much for agreeing to come in and give us something to listen to and something to ignite a discussion over.
I see what you did there. Thank you for having me. And yeah, let's light it up.
All right, we want to just dig right in. Let's go. Let me prepare the mid range on my my. All right, here we go.
That intro is legendary for a guitar tone, but that bass growl is so meaty and fantastic.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Cuts right through there.
I was born in this town. Live here my whole life. Probably come to die in this town. Live here my whole life. Never anything to do in this town. Live here my whole life. Never anything to do in this town. Live here my whole life. Probably learn to die in this town. Live here my whole life. Nothing to do. Sit around at home, stare at the walls, stare at each other and wait till we die. Stare at each other, wait till we die. Probably come to die in this town. Live here my whole life. There's kerosene around. Something to do. There's kerosene around.
utter chaos.
I don't think they mixed this with earbuds in mind.
For a song encapsulating rural boredom, I find it interesting that the lyrics are specifically boring, very repetitive, just like life. And this is the only song they really did that recapitulates the same vocal line so much over and over again.
Yeah. Well, even that kind of repetitive bass line, I mean, it's relentless, you know, and it's kind of reflective of what they're talking about.
Kerosene around, find something to do. Kerosene around, set me on fire.
I struggle to find other songs with that sense of just literal explosion when that guitar comes back in.
Set me on fire. Kerosene. Set me on fire. Kerosene. Set me on fire. Kerosene. Set me on fire.
You think it's gonna come back on the one, but not quite.
Kerosene around, something to do. Kerosene around, now what do we do? Got kerosene, now what do we do? Jump kerosene, now what do we do? Kerosene around, that's nothing to do. Jump kerosene, now what do we do? Never anything to do in this town. Never anything but jump kerosene. Never anything to do in this town. Never anything, jump kerosene. Set me on fire, 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 kerosene. Set me on fire.
All
Are you
right.
awake now?
Wow.
Oh, yeah. That was just what I needed after my morning coffee. Of course, Ben, does that put you in a nice, relaxed evening mood for your time? Time zone?
Well, funnily enough, you know, after this, we're going to be heading out into town, and now feel like really confident and
Ready
ready
for
to go.
traffic.
Yeah. Ready to lose it on the
Ben's
tube.
going to be road rage, all of that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, the legendary Kerosene by Big Black.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah,
a great
that
choice,
song
man.
changed. That song literally changed the course of my life.
So what was your music background prior to that? Was that like the first thing that you heard that was the kind of that raw and repetitive and in your face?
It was among the first big kind of punk and no wave bands that I really liked. One of the reasons I liked punk was that it was anti-establishment, and it often talked a lot about socioeconomic issues that other musical styles really weren't addressing. But it was Big Black that really felt like, for the first time, I was hearing music made about my daily life and the everyday banal kind of evil that you run across often in small towns, but obviously it's pervasive everywhere. But you know, those little evils like alcoholism and domestic abuse and child abuse, and this song just basically about being led to crime and violence literally because you're bored in a rural town and there's nothing else to do, and the bad habits that can lead to. And it was also the first time I ever heard music that aggressive using a drum machine.
Mm.
Big Black always credited their drummer as Roland on their albums. And they started by using the TR-606, but I think on this track, it's pretty clearly a TR-707. And that kind of just utterly relentless, inhuman drumming, I was just like, this fits so perfectly.
Mhm.
And it really, Big Black, calling it a nihilistic band is pretty kind. But like that choice for them musically really made sense. And so it was the first time in my experience, growing up in a rural area, I was not part of the first generation to hear Throbbing Gristle or even Cabaret Voltaire. I wasn't introduced to until much later. And this song came out in 1986, I believe. And it was the first time that I heard that kind of thing. And that combination of electronic instruments in a context of aggression was completely eye-opening. And that led me to then start listening to similar bands like Godflesh, which was still an all-time favorite heavy band of mine. And I grew up in the 80s where almost all of my friends who got into electronic music, they got into it because of new wave and kind of electropop. And that music didn't speak to me when I was that age. And so I came to electronic music through that song. I came in through the scuzzy, disgusting back door into electronic music, where it started with Big Black. And then that got me into Godflesh. That got me into Skinny Puppy, Frontline Assembly, Front 242. You see where this is going, and, started to widen out a little bit from there, or a lot from there. And so this song, you could argue, got me into making music that was, dark, but primarily electronic eventually.
Yeah, so I wanted to go back to the textures of the song and what you mentioned about the difference between the drum machines and then the textures that were built on top of the drum machine. How did you know the difference between those two models of the drum machine, and what other instruments did they build on top of it, and what were we hearing?
The only reason besides being a gigantic nerd, the other reason I know the difference between a 606 and a 707 is I actually, on the shelf right over there, I own a 606. And there's this kind of almost more like an Alesis HR16, like woody snare sound in the 707, because the 707 used more samples than analog synthesis to create its drum sounds. So it has this kind of boxy, woody sound to it as a result. Whereas the 606, it's a lot of people infamously don't like its kick because the resonance is very, very short, unlike an 808. And there's a crack to the synthetic snare on the 606 that is more metallic than the kind of woody, rounder sound of the 707. But this song has a unique place in kind of punk and rock history because of that guitar tone at the beginning of the song. And people almost universally say, like, it's like the sound of breaking glass. And it's just, it doesn't sound like a guitar at all. It's a texture. And so Steve Albini is really was the person really behind Big Black. It went through some lineup changes. Two of its members went on to be in a equally legendary punk band called Naked Raygun, and they all were in kind of the Chicago upper Midwest punk scene in the late 70s, early 80s. So Albini now, of course, is a world famous all analog recording engineer. So a lot of people, I think, hear a song like Kerosene, and then when they realize that's the same Steve Albini, who is like this god of engineering right now, it's like, whoa, what? but it's that opening guitar texture is just open harmonics on the guitar. And Albini is also infamous for wearing a guitar strap around his waist instead of over his shoulder. So when you see him perform, it looks really weird. He wraps it around his waist. And it's just, I've never seen anyone else do it. It's very bizarre. But his playing style on this song is just, he's got so much gain on his guitar during those texture things. He's barely touching his strings. And and he was a big fan of this thing called the HP1 harmonic percolator. And it was this really unique pedal that has only been cloned a few times, and they're very, very hard to find. And it has this unique topology where it's a germanium transistor going into a silicon transistor. And so it's basically a fuzz pedal. And in theory, the topology creates only even harmonics, which you think would sound round and smooth, but it has this buzzsaw style tone to it. And Albini still uses the HP1 harmonic percolator in his current band Shellac. And so you can hear little moments of that kind of glassy, metallic, crystalline tone, even in his work with Shellac many, many, many years later. And he also was a big fan, even back then, creating this music that was extremely simple and very repetitive, but he'd get really nuanced with mic placement. So he'd usually have like a couple of different mics on his speaker cabs and choose the, kind of a darker tone versus a brighter tone per song. And so his knowledge of all this stuff, I think, is really what sums up into this sound of just unbelievable aggression. And I think it was Justin Broderick from Godflesh. He described his music in Godflesh as the sound of ultimate shittiness. and to me, like, Big Black is kind of the American version of that. They do not deal with light topics, but they deal with topics that, especially in the 80s, no one was writing music about. And they were just kind of like, we want to shine a light on all those little evils that we all are exposed to all the time, that society needs to reckon with and have an active discussion around, because we're not talking about some of this stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of funny you mentioned the repetitive nature of it being reflective in the lyrics. I'm not familiar with Big Black, any of their other work yet. I'll go back and give them a more thorough listen after this. But I'm curious, just from the rest of their catalog, is that something that is kind of consistent, or was that like a reflective instance of where they're kind of text painting with the repetitiveness and the relentless nature of this particular track, because that is what the lyrics are dealing with? Or is that just kind of their minimalistic style? I know punk in general, it can be kind of, to drive a point, it's repetitive in nature, but I'm just kind of curious about the rest of their back catalog.
I would say the rest of their music is similarly simple, but this is probably one of the slowest songs they've ever done.
Okay.
And it has this kind of dirgy, grinding shtick to it. The album this is off of is called Atomizer. And there are a couple of other songs that are also kind of slow and dirgy. One of them almost has this, which song is it on that album? I'm going to forget the name of the track, but there's a song that almost sounds a little bit like Don't Fear the Reaper, in terms of like an actual, it loops and it repeats, but there's a melodic progression to the guitars. It's not just all just insane texture. But I think that Atomizer is interesting because for me, it's also like a seminal overlap between punk and no wave. And no wave, or, noise rock or art rock coming out of New York City at the time, like Sonic Youth is the ultimate example of that. But Swans is another really good example of that, at least at that time. So I think a lot of these bands at the time were playing around with guitar as texture instead of guitar as this melodic hero instrument. You know, it's like, this is as far away from Yngwie Malmsteen as you're ever going to get. But a lot of their other songs, like the musical figures, repeat because it's punk. It's very, very simple musically, but the lyrics are a lot more. They don't have that repetitive grinding, saying the same thing over and over again kind of vibe, which makes me feel like for a song about living in a rural town and being so bored you're driven to violence, that just it's perfect. You wouldn't want to write the song any other way.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's for you or anyone else listening, this song is so influential. St. Vincent did a live cover of it. You can see on YouTube.
Okay.
And her cover of it is insane. It's note for note. She gets close with the guitar tone too. I mean, she's a fantastic guitarist. I really have a lot of respect for her playing. And so clearly I'm not the only one who has really been influenced by this. And you see this song listed in, top 20, top 100 lists of rock songs you have to hear before you die, because it's been that seminal and influential for almost 4 decades now.
When did you start to get the bug for wanting to know about the microphone placements, the type of gear they were using? What you've mentioned about the impact it had on you growing up in that emotional sense, but tell us about that tech side and what has become so much of what you do as an artist.
I think it's because around this time I was listening to Big Black. I was a huge fan of the Chameleons as well in the 80s. And I was just listening to a lot of bands that for some reason, how their music wound up speaking to me was the textural elements more than the melodic elements. And that's something that you hear in my music to this day. I can't do a song that doesn't have a key and doesn't have some sort of melodic or harmonic structure to it. But even more contemporary artists like Alessandro Cortini is out there constantly showing that timbral progression through a song can be as valid a means of movement and progression as melodic progression. I mean, even the Italian composer Giacinto Scalzi famously wrote his Quattro Pezzi piece, where every single instrument in an orchestra is playing one note the entire time. And so the only way you can progress through a piece like that is timbral progression and arrangement progression. And so to me, that wound up kind of stoking an interest more in sound, or as much in sound as in music. And so I think my first kind of electronic music setup was a drum machine, a 4-track tape recorder, and a guitar. And I started actually just trying to give myself something to play against so I could become better at guitar. But then I think, influences like Big Black and other bands made me start to realize, well, the textural exploration to me was just felt as rewarding as the melodic and kind of building up my guitar chops kind of progression. And I think maybe I grew up in the wrong era to play saxophone is maybe what I really mean. My first instrument that I got super serious about was saxophone, is, sight reading music and improvising, and I got really quite good at it. And if only Colin Stetson was around back then, I probably would have stuck with it. But it just felt, as an instrument to me at that time, it felt limiting. And it also is not an immediate instrument. It's just like, I've got this great, cool idea for saxophone. Let me stick a reed in my mouth for 15 minutes and wait until I can actually express that idea. And so that's one of the reasons I hopped to guitar, because it's like, have an idea, grab the guitar, boom. You can just, or piano, like these instruments that are super immediate are the ones that wound up speaking to me as I matured as an artist and I understood what I wanted to say and how.
Mm.
Yeah,
But
it's interesting you mention the saxophone because as a classical pianist, I grew up, well, through university especially, I was an accompanist for lots of the other instrumentalists and accompanied a bunch of saxophones. Those of us who could sight read the best would do that. And some of the saxophone rep was always some of the most experimental, even in that world.
oh, interesting.
And we all hated it as pianists because our parts were insane. And of course, the saxophone only has one line to worry about. We're like, this. So that's. I wonder if there's maybe some sort of correlation between your early saxophone work and then your wanting to get into more experimental harmonies and things.
Maybe, maybe. I mean, I certainly that being a saxophonist, even though I stopped playing, did get me interested in artists like Ornette Coleman and John Zorn in college. So when I was in university, I was pretty open to that kind of experimentation, and that's when I started backfilling my electronic music education. Started listening to Throbbing Gristle and some of the more experimental stuff, both in terms of acoustic and electronic music. But yeah, maybe that prefigured my interest in other timbres. I don't know. I wonder if I had been exposed to people like Coleman and Zorn at that time while I was playing saxophone, if that would have changed my path. I don't know. It might have.
Well, everything that we kind of come across shapes us in some way, I think. Yeah. So,
how did you feel when you first came across Colin Stetson? Because I went to a gig a few years ago, and he was supporting the main act that I was going to see. And by the end of his 45-minute performance, I left so that I could go and get the album and go and speak to him and get it signed. And then came back late to the show. It was that powerful. I just wondered,
wow,
what impact did it have on you as a artist and musician when you sort of heard what he was doing? Did it have any?
It was a radical impact for me, because I think if you listen to it cold and you don't understand what his technique is, it's still insane.
Yeah.
But then when you realize it's almost all live and it's all looping and circular breathing, and then you watch a performance either live or there's plenty of them on YouTube. There's a really nice extended set he did for the Adult Swim show on Cartoon Network. It's inhuman. Like what he does, I mean, even with circular breathing, like it's inhuman. And the fact that he instruments he mics up his saxophone with contact mics, so he can do rhythmic stuff with the valves, and he uses a throat mic, so he can actually also layer in vocalizations as he plays saxophone. It's like, this is just such next level thinking that I've never seen anyone even attempt. The only other artist I've ever seen come even close is a bassoonist here in the States named Dana Jessen. She teaches, I think, at a university in Ohio, and she also mics up her bassoon and can do all sorts of interesting kind of extended techniques. But Stetson is like, his music is a little bit like Big Black. I find it a little bit relentless because he just never stops. And there's this overwhelming density of sound and figures in his music that I find intimidating and powerful. And some of his music can be very like emotionally, intellectually overwhelming. And doing all of that just through pushing air through your lungs, and that is how you're making all these sounds, like that is freaking unbelievable to me.
Well, I saw him with I can't remember her name. Her surname might have been Nielsen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they definitely done one album together. Maybe they've done some other projects too, but it was just that in the performance, the the movement became, for me, as important as the sound as well. The movements they were making and the way that they were quite obviously getting lost in what they were doing as well, why they were doing it. It just showed how talented they were, quite simply.
You use the term "getting lost." His solo work certainly is very trance-inducing. I find.
Yeah, I agree.
The other thing, of course, he's becoming really well known for, which dovetails nicely with one of my other big interests, is he's doing a lot of scoring these days. So his score for the horror movie Hereditary is a legendary piece of work, and it's entirely voice and woodwinds. And you listen to it, you're like, hey, he used a synth there. He's like, nope, that is not a synthesizer. That is all stuff coming from my lungs into a tube. And or just, vocal performance. And I think that was maybe his first score, or his first major score. And he did The Color Out of Space, which is another horror movie based on Lovecraft, that uses a lot more sophisticated kind of processing techniques. But his work as he develops as an artist, both solo and in the service of media composition, he's endlessly fascinating to me.
It doesn't get more organic than a contact mic to the throat. I think that's pretty much his.
Well, you could swallow it and then have it. You could compose with your stomach, I suppose.
That is true. That would be truly that would be a warm sound, I guess we could call it. Warm, organic, analog, truly analog.
My score sounds like fingers mucking around in pudding. How does that sound? Great. Suddenly don't want my lunch, but it sounds great.
Yeah. To kind of shift not too terribly far from where we're talking, I wanted to mention, I think your latest full-length album, A Shadow No Light Can Make, which I recommend everyone should go out and listen to. We'll leave links to all of this stuff in the description. And it was all serialism, if I'm correct, right? And 12-tone rows and all of that stuff that kind of started or originated with Schoenberg and Webern and all of those guys. So I was a little curious, what inspired you to take that route with that album? Was that the first time you've tried to do something in a serialistic fashion? Does it kind of come maybe from the electronic side with sequencing in the electronic realm, or how did you settle on that idea?
Oh, thank you for asking. I've struggled enjoying.
There's a shameless, not a shameless plug.
You'd be shameless if I did it. Thanks, Ben.
Right, exactly. That's the opposite of it.
And I'm sorry I turned away. I was listening the whole time, but I wanted to say that, to anybody else that's sort of, watching or listening, this is one of the most sonically inspiring albums that I've ever been able to lay my hands on. So, carry on,
just
please.
before you get into the question that I asked, I would add to that in saying that what Nathan is talking about in terms of combining, in this case, serialism or harmonic ideas and structure with sound design elements and processing in unique ways, that album is absolutely top notch. It's really a great listen. So. Yeah. Take it away, Nathan. What did I ask you?
No,
I don't remember.
Thank you both. The irony is that I've actually struggled to enjoy listening to music written using the 12-tone technique. And it actually, I had a period there for a while where I was like, let me challenge myself and go back and listen to stuff that I used to think I didn't like. And I started kind of going through a playlist of stuff. And I found that, a lot of it still didn't speak to me. Some of it did. And I found that Schoenberg's work specifically, I started really liking. But I still didn't like Webern. Still didn't like Boulez. And like, to me, Webern and Boulez are like the Altekra of classical music. Very alienating, to me, intellectually super interesting. But I started to like some of Schoenberg's original work, and I'm like,
Well, just
wow, I didn't expect
just to
that.
jump in there, a lot of people that maybe are less familiar with Schoenberg and only know him from the 12-tone stuff, like he had an entire period before that where he wrote in a more functional way, and he was
Right.
equally excellent at that. And that also kind of translates where he still has an idea for like melodic shape and progression that is kind of lacking in some of the other stuff. So I totally agree on that point.
Yeah, and I actually wound up reading a couple of his books on composition, and so I'm like, what would happen if I tried this? This is going to be wacky, because like the whole serialism thing, for those who may not be aware, is that it seems at first a fairly arbitrary way of making music, because you create what's called a tone row, and you have to use all 12 notes in the chromatic scale. None can repeat, but it's up to you the order in which they go. And then you basically you make more rows. You take that basic row, then you offset that row by a certain number of semitones over and over and over again, and then you wind up with this grid, and you can perform each of those rows in either direction, forward or reverse. And I think once I started to experiment with it, the big aha moment for me was it started to actually do some of the things that I love most about the music that I listen to, which is go from consonance to dissonance to consonance again, even within one melodic line. And so all of a sudden I'm like, oh, wow. And like, there's no such thing as a key. Your entire musical universe is generated by this core tone row. And I realized that, wow, this winds up sounding very sweet and melodic. And then 4 notes later, it's dark and twisted and really sour. And then it kind of congeals again, depending on how you play these tone rows against one another. And I just wound up falling head over heels in love with that method. And for the vibe and kind of narrative I had in my head for that album, it seemed like an absolutely natural fit. And so I just went all in. And I would say probably 80% of that album is composed using serialism. There's a couple of pieces that are just kind of, there's one piece that's traditionally composed, one piece that is totally rip off of Skelzy, who we've already mentioned, which is just everything is playing octaves of one note the entire time. And it just progresses in terms of density and timbre. So that was my journey into serialism, and I gotta say, it was a total revelation. And time will tell how much I continue to work with that system. But now having that in my toolkit, oh my gosh, it was quite a journey, and it was terrifying, but I'm glad I tried it.
Yeah, well, it's one surefire way to avoid like tonally centering a melody on like 1 or 2 notes, like so many often do, and those are often the ones that are forgettable. They don't take us on a journey, because there is no center. There's you have no note. And also the other thing which I talk about when I talk composition with people is like avoid doublings. Don't double. Anytime you double, you're weakening your harmony, right? So you can't double either. So it's kind of, you take away all of those things that, maybe you do very sparingly in more traditional harmony, So yeah, thank you for sharing that inspiration with us.
Oh, you bet. It was also interesting to actually experiment being really strict with serialism, where in your performance, you can't move until you can't go to the next note until you've played that note. And it seems really restrictive. But then when you start to you have that epiphany of like, oh, well, the only thing I can actually play with is rhythmic delivery. So you can, hit one note 4 times as eighth notes before then you go on to the next one as a whole note. So you get this you can still get this kind of breathing, evolving rhythm to it while still being strict in terms of like not sounding things out of the tone row order. But yeah, if anyone is interested in that technique, I would say read up on it. There are serialism calculators on the web now where you can just enter one tone row and it does all the offsets for you, which is a huge time saver. Unless you love spreadsheets. If you like making music using spreadsheets, it's a great technique.
What were some of your favorite instruments to record? What were some of the instruments that caused you the most problem where you were trying to capture what you had pictured before the process began?
Well, one of my challenges is that I don't play fretless stringed instruments, really, like violins. I own a violin. I own an electric cello. I'm learning to play them slowly. But what I found was, especially given the inherently kind of dark, unsettling nature of that album, I wound up both performing a bunch and mixing that in with sample instruments.
Right.
And that was one of those weird success stories where I was struggling to perform this on my own. So I started using samples, but the samples didn't sound as much like me as I wanted them to. So actually mixing in, frankly, fairly craptastic performances low in the mix made it feel a lot more organic and felt a little bit more unique to me. So that was good. One of the things that I also that features a lot on that album is this kind of recurring textural motif of bowed cymbals. And so I played bowed cymbals a lot and found that they were really strident. I was using a 17-inch crash cymbal primarily. And so almost everything, I just basically very speeded it down by half. So it's all bowed cymbals, but pushed an octave down, sometimes 2 octaves down. So in that technique, I wound up recording almost everything at 192 kilohertz so that I could slow it down towards 48 kilohertz, just drop it by 2 octaves, and there's no aliasing. I did some tape processing to move things around as well. And one of my biggest desires on that album was to work with a human voice. So I hired 4 different vocalists, completely different rooms all over the world. And I was just terrified how hard it would be to make it sound like they were all in the same room. And I think basically what saved me was I requested everyone get really close to the microphone, like record super dry. And I gave at least half of them like these technique challenges, like sing as quietly as you can while like barely holding pitch. And so a lot of the or like start singing a note that's pure with vibrato, and then have give it vocal fry as the note progresses, like disintegrate the note as you sing it. And so I think that wound up producing a lot of vocal takes that didn't excite whatever room they were in. And so all of a sudden blending it together actually wound up being really, really easy. So I was very lucky to have this kind of pandemic style, everyone's recording in their own space, still wind up, I think, sonically working. And then of course, nothing sounds as good as human vocals run through Paul's stretch to 16 times their normal length. So I'm pro Paul stretch and I vote.
You must have felt like you were building up it sounds like you were building up almost full-on sample libraries and banks with all of this experimentation. I mean, how much of these vocal takes didn't you use in the end?
There were a couple. I had everyone do basically like three takes for me, and so some takes were just better than others. Some of the vocal disintegration bits felt a little cartoonish, so I wound up kind of using only some of them. And then there's one track where I decided to experiment and actually chop out all of the sung notes and only play back the inhales of the vocalist before the notes were sung. and the track is called Awoken. And I've had a lot of people write me saying, like, I find it hard to actually breathe listening to this because it's disrupting my breathing. And I'm like, whoa, that's unintended consequence, but I'll take it. So it's funny. After I finished this project, I started watching the YouTube channel of a composer named Jason Graves, and he is a game composer for the most part, and is best known for doing all of the music for the Dead Space series. And come to find out, he composed those soundtracks in the exact same way. He just basically showed up at orchestral sessions with a list of gestures and figures and extended techniques, and he built his own sample libraries. And then, because he was like, imagine going to a client and saying, like, I can't mock this up for you. It's impossible. So I'm going to spend all of your budget now to record all this individual, really atomic level stuff. And then I'll share with you what it's going to sound like. Imagine the client going, like, you're going to what? How are we going to know what we're going to get? And so he actually wound up doing the exact same thing. And this was years ago. Now sample libraries are a lot more robust, and extended techniques are often recorded as part of sample libraries now, but 15 years ago, that absolutely wasn't the case. And I do find that a lot of my creativity comes out in the edit as much as it does in the performance. So that just wound up being a really natural way for me to work.
What are you working on now? When can we expect to hear something new?
Well, the last thing I did was a collaborative kind of narrative sound art project called the Ambiguity Research Institute, kind of a transmedia storytelling project where there's a website, and I did that with Rob Bridget, who's a game audio director in Montreal. And then my next solo release is coming out in November, and that's going to be a more thorough blending of a lot of the acoustic stuff that I was doing on A Shadow No Light Could Make, with my kind of core electronic practice, and really blurring the point of not being able to tell which is which. So lots and lots of extreme processing on acoustic stuff, lots of very careful electronic sound design to make things feel acoustic. So that's going to be coming out in November. And then probably next year, I've got a project where it's going to be an experimental release where all of the sounds were performed by the wind. But I've edited all of it together into this kind of musique concrète composition where I basically built structures out of piano wire and steel and wood, had the wind play it, and then that's going to turn into an album coming out in 2022.
Goodness me. That's
just a couple things then.
That sounds so exciting. So exciting
stuff.
It's been fun. Keeps me off the streets. Keeps me off the streets and keeping from burning things down in my small town that I live in.
Keeps you out of the kerosene.
I gotta bring it back.
I just have one last question. I think probably the most important question that we've asked today. Who's your favorite mastering client, myself or Ben?
Don't make me choose. My favorite mastering client is Anna. Anna Yarborough.
Well, you do get more work from her, so that
there you go.
Yes.
No, that's, one of the things that I love about being a mastering engineer is, as my day job, is I get to collaborate with so many people. Like both of you are clients, as you mentioned. Anna from Rhodium is another client, and I have many others. But it keeps me on my toes aesthetically, because I get to just deeply listen to people making aesthetic choices I never would. And so I'm providing a service, but I also feel like I'm really blessed because every project I work on, I'm learning a ton just from being so focused in listening to it and trying to reverse engineer, like, oh, how and why does this song work the way it does? And I just find it an endless, like, I get as much education from my clients as my clients get from me. And like, if that's my day job, I'm living a pretty blessed life.
Yeah, and as Ben mentioned, Nathan is a fantastic mastering engineer. We've both worked with him in the past. He's incredibly great communicator and tells us all of the things that we should have done better, but is also very kind in the way that he does it. So,
Well, if he makes
yeah.
makes you feel any better, I
I
don't
would
always
recommend-
master my own work, so I get to sit in that uncomfortable chair plenty.
Yeah, it's good to be on both sides of the,
Oh, yeah.
of the email from time to time. But yes, that's Studio Obsidian. If you're interested in using Nathan's mastering services. This has been fantastic, Nathan. I don't want it to end, but I want to respect your time, especially since we've had to cancel due to internet issues for it seems like 2 years now. But
Well, it was such a joy talking to you both. I wish that we had more opportunities and more reasons to chat more frequently, but this has been super fun, and thank you so much for asking me to join you today.
Of course,
Thanks
we'll
so
have to
much
do it
for-
again.
Thanks so much for joining
Absolutely.
us. We'll link everything into the comments. So if you want to delve into Nathan's work further, then you'll find it all in there. But thanks so much, Nathan, and we can turn the record button off now and all have a relaxed conversation. instead.
Okay, now we get now
Let the
we
rest of
really
my
get
hair
to talk
down.
about stuff. Right.
Let's do
Thanks,
that.
guys.